Hello, my name is David Brett, and I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. I would like to talk to you today about the crisis that is gripping our province surrounding Indigenous land claims like the Cowichan decision, the instantiation of DRIPA into our province. And what I would like to tell you today should shock you and change the way you think about these issues in our province. I'm standing today on the location of the New Westminster Senior Secondary School. And I'm about to explain to you what happened here and why your thinking should completely change on the reconciliation discussion in this province. And specifically, I'm going to contend that there has been a cover-up with respect to the Kamloops Residential School alleged discovery of child remains at that school. That's right, a cover-up. Now, why am I just taking the time to do this? Because the truth and reconciliation concept requires truth. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in getting to the truth on this issue. So now, why am I standing here? Where am I standing? Now, if we look around here, we're at the corner of 8th Street and 8th Avenue in New Westminster. 8th Street used to be called, back in the day, Douglas Road. Right here where I'm standing is the location of a known cemetery. It was known as the Potter's Field, or also called the Pauper's Field. It was where, from the 1860s through to the around 1920, people of limited means would have been buried. Now, as you can see, there are no grave markers here. In fact, this entire several blocks of what was known as Douglas Road, all the way up to 10th Avenue, multiple city blocks, were a series of cemeteries. The Potter's Field. There was the New Westminster Public Cemetery, what was called Douglas Cemetery, and then beside that, a Chinese cemetery. So here's the shocker, that for whatever reason, these cemeteries became lost to the sands of time. They had stables built over them. They had an army barracks built over them during the Second World War. There was a hospital built. And then in the 1950s, there was a high school built literally on top of these cemeteries. So how does this tie into the Indigenous narrative? Because it is believed that Indigenous people are buried here, and a very significant person is contended by the Chilcotin or the Chilcotin people to have been buried here, Chief Ahan, who was one of the individuals that was executed following the massacre that occurred during the Chilcotin War, and that was in the 1800s, and for which Judge Begbie famously became associated, and the subject of opprobrium, and his statue was removed, which is a slightly different story. But I'm holding in my hands here a report by Golder Associates from 2017. This is an archaeological study. Archaeological Impact Assessment Interim Report. Now, why was this report requisitioned? Well, the school, the high school that was built here, has long been proposed to be replaced. And there was a plan in place and funding in place by the province to rebuild New Westminster Senior Secondary School. And there was concern that part of, or any of the new construction, would end up being on top of burial sites. So what they did is they said, well, we need to investigate this. They engaged Golder, and they conducted an archaeological review which included ground penetrating radar, followed by borehole analysis and excavations of the anomaly. So there were hundreds of anomalies found by the GPR, but of those anomalies, they narrowed down around 38 suspected grave sites. So long story short, the excavations and borehole analysis of the suspected grave sites found that none of the grave sites were had human remains or any indication that they were in fact grave sites. So that all of the suspected grave sites from the GPR were negative, were found to be spurious. So but nevertheless, just out of respect for the cemeteries that were along here, it was decided that this new school would be built on the far side of the property, over by Mercer Stadium, for people who know the lay of the land here, along 6th Avenue. So how does this suggest a cover-up? Well, in relation to the Kamloops story and the 215 graves. Well, here's the thing. This archaeological report was circulated to 21 First Nations, including the Chilcotin. So people like Joe Alphonse were very much involved in demanding that this work be done, and was very cognizant of all of the work and that was done here. So he would have known in 2017 that this ground penetrating radar had the potential to be completely spurious, that GPR was in fact quite unreliable tool for locating graves. So if that's the case, Chief Joe Alphonse, when the Kamloops announcement was made, he said to the Vancouver Sun, and I'll just quote here, he says, "It takes the discovery of 215 unmarked graves to suddenly make this real. Well, people have been talking about this for years." Think about those words. Suddenly make this real. What is he talking about? Making it real. He would have known that the GPR results here in New Westminster were very not real. They were just simply anomalies. So let's delve into this a little bit further. This report, and we will share these images in a reply to this post, includes the visual depictions of the various anomalies that were discovered where they proposed to build the school. That includes this location right here. There was historical documentation showing that there were people who were buried here. So, interestingly, the 2021 Sarah Bollier Kamloops GPR scientific disclosures, which were not a full-blown 120-page report, rather it was just a 14-page summary PowerPoint presentation, does in fact include these visual GPR anomalies where people who are following this can see them. They're these little parabolic anomalies and squiggles in the ground. Well, what Sarah Bollier indicated were probable burials, and you can just look at the data yourself, side by each. In the Golder report are indicated to be drain lines. So anomalies that to the average layperson appear presented by Bollier as probable burials. And there's other similarities, including the depth. So in the Golder report, you have these suspected drain lines around less than a meter below the surface. The same thing in the Bollier report. They're less than a meter below surface, and they have these very, very distinct features to them. She calls them probable burials, and Golder calls them drain lines. So here's what I think is going on here in the province of BC, and why it's so important for everyone to understand what happened here in New Westminster, is that sure, it is not the best and highest performance of our society to have built over and built army barracks and other things, and allowed cemeteries to go fallow, and for grave markings and the existence of these cemeteries to disappear. But the Chilcotin insistence that their chief was buried here was designed to further a very specific narrative, the narrative of genocide. Now let's dig into that a little bit. The Chilcotin chiefs that were executed as a result of a trial over which Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie presided, related to what was known as the Chilcotin War. And during the time of the Caribou Gold Rush, someone hatched a plan to build a road into where the gold rush was, and it was up the coast in an area called South Bentinck Arm. The details aren't important, but the narrative that the Chilcotin and activist communities would like us to believe is that the road builders had a genocidal intent, that they carried Hudson's Bay blankets that were supposedly contaminated with smallpox. They were intentionally distributing these blankets, and they were using the blankets to exterminate Indigenous people. This is a complete myth. Hudson's Bay blankets were ubiquitous throughout the province already. They were like the currency with many Indigenous people. They were just as common as anything. So, and the idea that road builders would be somehow delivering smallpox, well, that's a rather slow way to deliver it, to build a multi-hundred-mile road in from the coast, when there's already a major European population at Barkerville near Quinnell, where the Caribou Gold Rush was happening. So this narrative is just simply accepted as truth. So similarly, the Kamloops GPR data was used to create a hysteria around a genocide that did not happen. And Chief Joe Alphonse of the Chilcotin and all the other First Nations people who were part of this, they had, when they were doing the excavations and the other work around the anomalies, they had Indigenous people working as field assistants so that they would be included. So everyone knew that the GPR results here came up negative. Now, as we can clearly see, there's no protesters out here in the Westminster protesting the fact that this cemetery has unmarked graves. There's no markings here. There's no markings anywhere. Is it a tragedy that there's no markings? Yes, but there's no one. The only people pushing a narrative surrounding the unmarked graves here are the Indigenous community, specifically the Chilcotin, who are working very hard to keep alive the idea that Chief Ahan is buried here. In fact, there was a great controversy in the Westminster at the school board, where they made a presentation that the new school should absolutely be called Chief Ahan School to memorialize their chief, because he was buried here, he was unjustly executed, etc., etc. So they not only, so this narrative that this chief was a martyr who was trying to defend his people against a genocidal invading force, which is basically manufactured history. This manufactured history is being continuing to be manufactured. And why isn't it so important for everything that's going on in BC right now? DRIPA, the Cowichan decision, private property rights, the Land Title Act. Because all of these decisions are playing out against the backdrop of this allegation of genocide on behalf of Canada. This is all of this work, all of this sacrifice, all of giving up of private property, all of our apology and sense of shame and in our history is supposedly driven by this factual narrative or this history of genocide. Well, when it comes to the establishment of unmarked graves using geophysics, this report shows you have to ground truth them. The word ground truth is used throughout this report. That's what they did. In the summer of 2016, they got out and they did their GPR. There was no hand-wringing, there was no great conflagration or soul-searching about whether they should or should not excavate or discover or work on the ground truthing process. They just proceeded to get on with it a couple of weeks later. Well, was this the colonial establishment trying to rush this through to sort of gloss over the fact that Indigenous people may be buried here? No, there was 21 Indigenous groups that were copied on this report. There were multiple permits issued by the local First Nations to do the work. They knew what was going on, they consented to proceeding, and it was done very quickly. Why are we 5 years later and there's no similar ground truthing going on at these supposedly hundreds of clandestine burials under suspicious and potentially criminal circumstances? What I would suggest is that it's simply a cover-up. That is an intentional plan to never excavate in order to drive a narrative that is not based on truth, to give advantage in negotiations surrounding specific claims, surrounding treaty negotiations, surrounding court decisions. Do I believe that the courts are untainted by all of this history? No. I personally don't trust that judges necessarily understand or know that this GPR data is out there, or that they've done all of the requisite research. This needs to be looked into in great detail, and people should be shocked that almost 5 years before the 2021 GPR announcement was made, we already knew the efficacy of GPR. Very low. It should not be trusted as an indication, and I'm sorry, but it is just so shocking to me personally that so many First Nations were involved in this work here in New Westminster, and to this day, there's no marking of the graves. There's proposed to be a memorial plaque, and the wording of it is being a lot of hand-wringing over it. But look at, we've got construction, we've got parking lots. There's no marking of these graves. So all of this should come as a great shock to people, and this should alter the perspective of the public in BC about what's going on with respect to Indigenous land claims in this province. I thank you for listening today. My name is David Brett, editor of the New Westminster Times.